Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Fundamentalists podcast.
New
I'm Elliot.
series.
A new what?
New series.
A new series.
Yeah.
Yes. You
Every
mean
time we
season?
new season, that's the term, new season.
Yes. New season. Yes. Every time we do a new episode, it is a brand new season. We do one episode seasons months apart. And sometimes in between, we'll do episodes, don't even upload them. Sometimes we talk about things as if they should be a podcast and there's no recording equipment. And then we're exhausted and we go watch a movie
Yeah.
like Heretic. So uh, this has been a long time coming. Thank you to everyone for your patience. We wanted to make sure it was a doozy of an episode. And so we have on this week of the Fundamentalists, what is class consciousness? And who better to talk about class consciousness with than Dr. Peter Rollins? Pete, how are you doing? How have you been? Tell the people what's going on with you.
I'm doing good. It is cold and dark here in Ireland, but it's lovely as well. And really glad to be back doing the fundamentalists.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, we have seen each other. I hung out in LA a few weeks
True.
ago and we never did an episode, but we did go to the movies together and all of
Exactly.
that. So I don't know. Hope maybe this is a sign of things to come.
Yes.
Yes.
And I'm very excited about this particular conversation. As you are in cold and dark Belfast, I am currently in Los Angeles as it burns to the ground
Mhm.
around me. I am in a very safe, good position right now. My wife and I are solid. A lot of people aren't doing so great, but it's been quite a scary, very surreal week here. It is currently January 14th. A week ago was about when the winds picked up. They're due to pick up again. So we're going to see what happens. But yeah, so this is actually a pretty decent segue because one of the things that I have a sentiment that I have seen, Pete, and I don't know if you've seen this, but there's the event, and then there's the talking about the event on media and in the news and on the internet, etc. And one sentiment I've seen, I'm curious what you think about it, is this idea of who cares about all of these fires because these are just rich people with investment properties. Why should we all be concerned about this? Who cares about the richy riches?
Mhm.
So then this is also, we haven't done a podcast since the cold-blooded assassination of the United Healthcare CEO, whose name I don't remember, but
Yeah. Yeah.
um, I didn't know he existed before and he doesn't exist now. So something happened in between there. He got killed by a guy named Luigi Mangione, and that also ignited a conversation around class and a lot of people going, hey, this is really about, billionaires and corporations oppressing and screwing over the quote unquote working class. Now, in between these events, the fires and the murdering of the CEO, at one point, my lovely wife turned to me one morning and she said, "What is class consciousness?" And I was like, "I don't know." And I tried to kind of ham-handedly describe what I thought it was in a way that didn't just sound like I was repeating the words, consciousness of class. But my guess is there's more nuance to it than that. My guess is it might not just be about not liking rich people. That doesn't seem to be a. Sorry about this. Do you hear that? A garbage truck in the
Oh,
background?
just about.
Apologies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so, what is class consciousness? How does it relate to Marxism? Why is Marxism akin to Satan in America, but somehow not Satan in
In
other
Europe.
Western
Yeah.
industrialized nations?
Yeah, no, I had brilliant. And also, I was in LA, maybe it was a month ago, and it was interesting to me because class consciousness is not something that people generally talk about in America. I don't think it's a well-known concept. We'll talk about how little Marx is known in America maybe in a second. But I went into a coffee shop because I was staying close to Larchmont Village and I was amazed at the price of everything. So I've been away from LA for a couple of years, living in Ireland, which is relatively cheap. The south of Ireland is
Mm-hmm.
like LA, to be honest, but the north of Ireland is a cheap place to live. And I went into a coffee shop and I couldn't believe that a coffee was $6 and then a dollar tip, so $7. And when I went to have like a burrito, an orange juice, and a coffee, you weren't really getting change of $50. And I was like, how is this possible? How
Mhm.
do people live? And I said to the girl behind the counter of Go Get 'em Tiger, I was like, how are people surviving? And she said, oh, class warfare is coming. And I was like, I think that's the first time I've ever heard, even though she was half joking, she was half serious, but the fact that somebody was talking about class issues rather than identity issues was kind of interesting because the only what's sometimes called the left. I don't think it is left, but the so-called left is identity consciousness or identity politics or the politics of otherness. And weirdly, with the assassination of the healthcare CEO, there was that seems almost like an event that not waking people up to something, to a question, but it did start a dialogue that was markedly different from the dialogue that I saw, in previous years. So yeah, so class consciousness, very interesting. We can jump in, but I'd love to start by telling you my background with Marxism,
Please.
because you mentioned it that in America, Marx is not read and misunderstood. Marx isn't even read. Right, that's pretty much even among within universities, and I can understand why because of the Cold War, et cetera, et cetera. But in Europe, everyone reads Marx, right? He's just one of the canonical thinkers. If you're doing a good humanities degree, you read whether it's, Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, Newton, Darwin, these are all just canonical figures. And Marx is primarily a philosopher, which again, some people in America might not know, but he's primarily a philosopher, a Hegelian philosopher, who applied that to the economy. And I learnt Marxism in Northern Ireland through a guy called James Daly, who just died a few years ago. And Marx was the first major theorist that I studied. Went on to study others, but I studied under James Daly. Now, James Daly was a hardcore what's called a Republican. If I say anything that you don't understand about Northern Irish politics, let me know. But he was a hardcore nationalist, Republican, Marxist. So much so that he wrote two brilliant books, but he wouldn't publish them with a publishing house. He published them with a student because he wouldn't publish with an organization that owned the means of production, right? He wanted to give it to somebody
Purist.
who had, yeah, he's an absolute purist. And in 1980, the UDA, the Ulster Defence Association, a paramilitary organization, broke into his house to assassinate him. He wasn't there, so they killed his wife, Miriam Daly, who was also a Marxist Republican intellectual.
The guy who taught you Marxism's wife was assassinated.
Yeah, yeah, because they were trying to assassinate him, and he wasn't there. He was at a conference, so they killed her. Um,
Is that how you do it with assassin? I thought if you're just, I mean, that seems a little mean.
yeah, well, so one is the UDA were
Don't
not the
call me
most disciplined.
crazy.
I call you crazy. Yeah, they're not the most disciplined. And also, Miriam Daly was herself a target. So, although she wasn't the main target, I know and maybe they wanted to kill both, but the story is that the official line is they went for him, she was there, and they took her out instead.
She
Yeah.
was what Winnicott refers to as the good enough Marxist.
Ah, yes, they're very good. Nice.
Okay.
Very well done.
Thank you. I'll
Um,
be here all day.
Yeah, nice. So yeah, so that he taught me, and he was amazing. He was like such a charismatic guy, so interesting. And I learnt Marxism as a young person under him. Now I came from a Protestant background, so I was kind of
Okay.
on the other side. But none of that mattered. But that's kind of
Well,
like my connection.
okay. So the Protestant side, is that in relation to, that's more the Irish political aspect, you Protestant Catholic, that dynamic?
Yes, so the
But
Protestants were unionists. Yeah.
but Protestant isn't okay. So, but union. Okay, so this is where I do not understand
Yes.
Irish politics at all. So, a the term Republican Marxist doesn't make any sense,
Yeah.
and but I know that Republican over there is a different thing. And
Yes.
then also, uh, the when you came, so but Protestant isn't antithetical to Marx, or is it? You
No.
being Protestant is not in and of itself the like, what was your take on Marxism prior to having studied Marx?
Actually, completely, I didn't have any background at all.
Okay.
But yeah, Marx was more connected to the Irish the Republican side than the loyalist side. So the loyalists were less Marxist. We made everything into side. Like, to be honest, Israel Palestine was an interesting example. One of the ways you would tell whether you were Protestant or Catholic is if you got stopped late at night by a gang of guys, they would say, do you support Israel or Palestine? And if you said you supported Palestine, that meant technically you were Republican. And if you said you supported Israel, it meant you
Hmm.
were loyalist. And, it wasn't anything to do with Israel or Palestine. They were just signifiers for whether you were on
Yeah,
one side or the other. And
like code.
yeah, it was code. Yeah, absolutely.
Isn't that interesting that I mean, I don't even think that most Americans, young Americans, and I'm speaking from also personal experience, but I don't know many people who could approach Marx with any kind of neutrality based on just how much he is um, what is the persona non grata
Yeah.
here of, and sort of just like the prime example of like the most extreme, like crazy left, like whatever people imagine that being is what Marx symbolizes. And
Yeah.
yet there are it's wild that there are people in other countries who could just approach him with this sort of like ambivalence and then make their own decisions. We're starting, I think, at a negative in that sense.
Absolutely. And I'm always very wary of talking about my relationship to Marx in America because I know it's a term that has so much freight. It means a lot of things. And the reading of Marx on the right and on the left in America, I think, is just completely wrong. So the right have this fascinating, quite amusing, but quite fascinating reading of Marx that basically Marxism became postmodernism, which became
Yeah.
identity politics, right? So and
Yes.
people like Jordan Peterson, James Lindsay, and others kind of like you have that narrative, which funnily enough, because I was trained in postmodernism and Marxism and in all of these things, and the truth is Marxists and postmodernists never got on. That was within philosophy inside baseball, but that was a big conflict.
Yeah.
That is a big conflict. So it's very funny listening to them. Now, when I listen to someone like James Lindsay, I can always go, oh, I can kind of see why he's saying that. It's sometimes it's really wrong, and sometimes it's like, oh well, oh, there are connections because of course all these people were talking to each other, like the Marxists and the
Yeah.
post-structuralists were all talking, and so there are some similarities, but in general, that's the narrative of the right. And
Yeah.
whereas within Marxist European studies, there's a big conflict between identity politics and class consciousness. Those are often seen as opposites. Some people don't, and again, we can get into that, but I don't think you can read Marx and see him as an identity politics person. And that's the weird reading on the left in America, is a lot of people on the left think that Marx is someone who would be very, very pro identity politics.
Yeah.
So that's a very
Yeah.
common thing.
That's where I get a little confused because being more on the left, I think in my mind, the more pure Marx idea, it can subsume identity politics, but I feel like you see it and maybe I'm just wrong, that maybe it's more antagonistic. And I was trying to like talk about this a little bit with my wife around this, of going like, this is the difference between leftist and liberal
Yeah.
in America. And I was like trying to explain like via example. Like the example I used was Elton John came out and was like, marijuana, legalizing marijuana is like the worst thing we could have ever done. And and then there was this like psychiatrist I follow who I then unfollowed because he kind of latched onto that, and he's also this sort of very wealthy, affluent person. And I was like, this seems to be an example where there is no class consciousness at play. It's someone going, marijuana bad, that's the end of the story, and not thinking about how marijuana legalization or illegalization has continually hurt lower and working class people. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I get what you're saying, and I think yes. And this is a good distinction to make because there are some who would say that what you're saying is kind of can be subsumed within Marxism. That's a Marxist critique, and could say, as you said, that some identity politics could be subsumed under the Marxist critique of the economy.
I mean,
I want to resist that, but anyway, keep going before
so
I
my
resist it.
like, yeah, to put it in maybe simpler, less weird example ways, but the my understanding is that a so let's get back to what
Yeah.
Marxism is for a second. This typical stereotypical idea of, people, socialism, whatever, being the working class owning the means of production,
Mhm.
not this idea of everyone gets paid $5 and we're going to take all your money.
Yeah.
It's like it's putting power back into the hands of the working class. But my understanding and it related to identity politics is that the marginalized groups in society are disproportionately affected by the critique of Marx. And so the
Yeah.
idea that they can't sit at the same table doesn't seem accurate, because the same people who the strict identity politics people are trying to help are hurt the most by the thing that the Marxists are trying to address directly.
Yes, that, and I would absolutely, that is true. So,
Okay.
that I think that's absolutely the case. Um, but then where I think the problem is the, and we'll get into it, but like the Marxist answer to that question, that problem, I don't think is in terms of identity politics, but in terms of class consciousness, and
Yeah.
that's the thing, that's the issue, and I'll say some, we can say some very broad brushstrokes for a second. There's a lot of movements in the liberal left which are about representation.
Yeah.
Marxism is about redistribution. So representation is about, I mean, Lisa Simpson once said it in The Simpsons, we need more female billionaires, right? We want more people
Yeah.
represented, more minority groups represented within the economic structure, which is not a bad thing, right? Or whatever, but that's not Marxism. That's not, at least like I'm an old school
Yeah.
Marxist, philosophical Marxist. And I say that like I'm a philosophical Marxist of sorts, and I have my own critique of Marx. But yeah, the idea of representation. That's why all the major corporations all latched onto identity politics, because it doesn't critique what's called the mode of production. It just kind of like changes who is potentially at the top. But the first thing to say, I think, about Marx at the very beginning is, in one way, Marx's argument, you could start by saying that Marx just doesn't think that capitalism is the end of history, right? So we have had three, well, we've a number, but there's three major what's called modes of production: slavery, feudalism, capitalism, right there, the three big ones. And what Marx kind of,
Absolute bangers.
yes, absolute bangers, yes. And what Marx argues as a Hegelian is that each of these systems that regulate the economy, they generate an antagonism within themselves that eventually cannot be solved by that system. So another system erupts out of the previous one that addresses the problems that arose from the last one. But then that system generates contradictions and antagonisms that cannot be solved within its frame. And so it erupts into another one. And each time the
That's Hegel,
antagonist,
right?
that's,
Then that's
yeah,
it.
that's Hegel.
Dialectic.
That's dialectics. That's Hegelian dialectics, but applied to the economy. And that's
Okay.
Marx's big move. That's why he's called a young Hegelian. He applies that Hegelian logic to the economy. And so, in one way, and I was talking to a really good friend of mine who is a Marxist, who is a Marxist, or sorry, a capitalist. And I said, like, in one sense, if you do not believe capitalism is the end of history, i.e., if we live long enough that this is like the final mode of
Yeah.
production, then that's the best place to start. Does capitalism generate contradictions and antagonisms that it cannot solve? And then what erupts out of that? Can a new mode of production arise? So that's dialectics. Yep.
Um, this guy that I saw do an interview with Zizek, I'm
Mhm.
blanking on his name. He wrote a book on techno feudalism.
Yeah. I wonder who
And
that
I've been
is.
thinking a lot about that lately, especially is because there does seem to be so many just like points of conversion happening right now in so many different sectors regarding things like climate, regarding things like AI is a big thing, and also just like the tech oligarchs and the increased control. Like I saw this thing yesterday where Mr. Beast is wanting to buy TikTok, and I was like, you know what, I'm gonna walk into the ocean because it's like that was like that's his play. He wants to be one of these like tech billionaire dudes who um and the guy that the techno feudalist guy was being like, we still pay rent to Amazon, even if you're this sort of small c capitalist, you're still paying to your techno feudal overlord, cloud rent in order to sell whatever you want. And so it's almost going more toward feudalism than it is anything than it is a
Yes.
any kind of socialist thing.
Yes, absolutely. And so there can be, in fact, there's what's called kind of almost retrograde moves. Potentially, we could fall back into some form of, as you say, kind of neo-feudalism, techno-feudalism. Nationalism is a form of, or national socialism is a form of capitalist socialism. There's various kind of retrograde moves that can happen. And the question is whether there's something positive, positive
Right.
direction that we can go. One other thing I want to mention about, again, I like to kind of simplify it or get very precise about what I at least mean by
Yeah.
Marxism is, Marx said famously that, and we've talked about this before actually, the move from what's called CMC to MCM, which is so in feudalism, for example, you make a commodity, I make a bottle
All
of
right.
water, I sell it for money, and then I buy another commodity, and that's very natural, and that's what we do. But with industrialization, we got to a point where you could only make a certain amount of handbags as a feudalist. You couldn't kind of make so many. You couldn't create an industrialized line to make loads. So you could never really uh, kind of get all of this extra capital. But in capitalism now, you can have money that you invest to make a commodity in order to get more money. And suddenly you get your enjoyment is not in the commodity that the money can buy, but you start to get enjoyment from the abstract increase of capital. So you need maybe a few pairs of shoes, but you kind of get enjoyment from having an excess. Like there's this weird, and it's called drive, obviously, in psychoanalysis, but capitalism really touches on a drive element of human beings that we get more enjoyment out of, like if you're in Bitcoin or whatever, out of getting more out of the number getting higher
Mhm.
and higher than ever taking the money out and buying something with the Bitcoin. So obviously people die poor when they're millionaires on Bitcoin. So
Yeah.
that's another element of Marxism is it relates to this enjoyment in terms of just the abstract increase of capital disconnected from what it can buy. Because by the time you get to so much money you can buy TikTok, there's kind of nothing really, very little that you can buy that you cannot buy,
Mhm.
but you still want more and more and more. Uh,
Yeah, this is related. I mean, obviously, I don't know that any conversation around class consciousness in America will not involve the name Bernie Sanders to some degree. But when
oh
he
yeah,
talks about obviously the oligarchs, the like we have 12,000 lobbyists in Washington D.C. for 535 something Congress people. So for every democratically elected official whose job is to represent their constituents, there is 20 to 25 lobbyists working with basically infinite pockets on behalf of corporations, or bottomless pockets, being like, hey, let me take you out to dinner, do you mind voting this way? And it pollutes what would be in theory a really nice democratic process. But then when it comes to the billionaire thing, there is this thing I think of going, oh, well, then if you're a billionaire, you're a bad person. Or if you're a rich person, you're a bad person, and you're the enemy. But like, is it really that? Because it's more like if I was a billionaire, my brain, I think that's so beyond, you're not living in the same reality other people are living in. And so that you shouldn't have a bigger impact on the election process or any political process than any other person. especially because your brain just warped. Like you're an alien walking among other people that exist, having to make money.
Yes.
Uh, so yeah,
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah,
The,
and
the, the
yeah, and on that, like Marx was never critical of capitalism, i.e., he thought it was the highest economic mode of production to date. And he was not a moral critique. I mean, it's not a moral
yeah,
critique at all. Marx was a good philosopher who simply argued that there was an inherent contradiction within capitalism that would generate repressions, depressions, and other catastrophes that would eventually lead to, well, either it's just falling apart, or would be able to be subsumed into something else. And he wrote very little about what that would look like because he talked about socialism and communism. Socialism is an interim between capitalism and communism. So,
yeah.
but he wrote very little about communism. Like I think it's about 14 pages and his vast amount of works because in a way Marx is going, you don't really know what the future is going to look like. It's about critiquing the present. And he had us a critique of that basically, and this will get us towards class consciousness. I mean, his critique in a nutshell was that capitalism works on this principle that nobody should be forced to buy or sell. There should be a market that's protected. So I go into the market and I want to sell TVs. I can go in there. Nobody's forcing me to buy or sell. I negotiate with you. We find a price. And if capitalism works well, we all get the right price because we've all negotiated, right? So that's the market. The free market is you go in as a free person and you freely negotiate, and that's the way it works. And by the way, on this, Marx never critiqued capitalism at its worst. He critiqued capitalism at its best. So he assumed, let's assume, because a lot of critiques, liberal critiques of capitalism, are the failures of capitalism. When there's bad CEOs, like a corrupt CEO, that's the problem, right? But Marx kind of gets us to go, well, imagine there's no corrupt CEOs. Imagine
Yeah.
there's no corruption, no bad billionaires. Let's imagine everyone's really good and really nice. Let's imagine like so. It almost Marx goes the opposite direction. Goes, let's assume that the capitalism works perfectly in its own system, that everybody's good. We've got rid of bad CEOs, bad billionaires, all of that. Marx says then, okay, in the perfect capitalist system, which is obviously just an ideal, it's a thought experiment. He says there is one thing that doesn't get the value that it's worth in the free market. There's one thing that you sell that never gets it's what it's worth, and that's
Time.
labor or labor.
Yeah.
Labor power. So you go in and I sell my labor power to you for $50 because it's worth $100 to you. You buy my labor power and my labor power generates more money. So, and that's called surplus value. So Marx said, and again, this is not a moral thing. He just said, this is an interesting thing with capitalism is there's one thing that in perfect capitalism can never get valued the amount that it's worth, and that's your labor power, because you have to undersell it. If a capitalist gave you the value of your labor power, they wouldn't be able to make a profit because
They
they
couldn't keep the
profit
lights
from
on.
couldn't keep the lights on, couldn't make a profit, right? So neither good nor bad, you just go, okay. But once you've got that little crack, this weird antagonism where surplus value is in the mix, what kind of happens is companies, because they have to be competitive with other companies, et cetera, they drive down wages as much as possible, drive up what they're selling, the price of what they're selling as much as possible. But eventually, the people who are working can't afford to buy the products. And what happens is there's nobody to buy stuff, and basically it starts to kind of collapse. So, again, at a very basic level, that's a basic Marxist idea. Surplus value will always generate a certain problem. Um,
I think I was at McDonald's probably years ago. I never go, but or maybe it was a week ago, but they are now doing this thing where it's like you can get this deal where it's a burger and a drink and a fry for like $5. And I was like, oh, this is like their compromise because people were complaining so much. Like people
yeah,
were not going to McDonald's because
too
McDonald's
pricey.
is still way too expensive. Like
Yeah.
I bought like maybe a sausage biscuit or something and it was $5. This the I got these pistachios,
Mhm.
$5 for this. This is
Yeah.
insane. I mean, it's pistachios. I think they're gold anyway, but and
I bought a burger in LAX from Burger King and it was
well, I mean,
$16.
yeah, yeah. In
Yeah.
airports, I don't know what happens to money in airports, but it just
Yeah.
goes away.
Yeah.
Uh, so that's really interesting about Marx, the idea that it's basically just even when capitalism works perfectly, there is still that lacuna. Is that the right word?
Yeah,
Isn't that what that
lagoon.
word means? Lacunae, lagoon. Anyway,
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I know the
there's a
word lagoon.
lagoon in it,
Yeah.
and it's down it flows a contradiction that kind of breaks the whole thing apart. But then, you have this other idea. You go, well, what's the alternative? What are you gonna?
Mhm.
I mean, what do you? And so, do you? Is this where like kind of the pessimism might come in? Because when you're talking about wages and wage increases, my understanding is, especially in America around the 80s with neoliberalism, the gap between wages and productivity continued to widen as productivity exponentially increased and then wages remained relatively stagnant. Uh, and so is there any going back? Like, is there any way or like, is there any way to fix this inherently broken system? And is that why, like, because I could see why it would get people really feeling very feudal about everything because there is no way it's so structurally like broken inherently, not in a moral way, but just like
Yeah.
there is that little thing that never quite adds up. Uh, how could you what do you do like
Yeah.
as a person existing within that system? Do you just run around like a college freshman being like capitalism sucks? Because that gets kind of old after a while.
Yes, and like you're making me think, like, what are the kind of almost touching on, I guess, three main problems, and then we'll see where we go from there. But like, so problem number one said surplus values, right? Like, weirdly, this creates a system where gradually prices go up, wages go down. People can't buy the products, recessions, depressions. Like, AI is going to be an interesting thing because if enough people lose their jobs, and kind of who's there to buy products, et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera. So there's one, surplus value seems to be an issue. Early Marx talked about alienation. So early Marx had a less scientific approach, but he had a very systematic approach where he said that when you're making things that you don't have any connection with, you just make widgets and you get a wage and you go home. That's an alienating way of living. And the thing about what I do and you do for a living, we're so lucky, right? This is so rare to be able to do what you love and get paid for it, right? Most people have to do a job where they're making money, their surplus value is given to somebody else, and they're not creatively engaged really in
Yeah.
what they're making. It's a bit depressing, and you spend most of your life doing that. In fact, Marx brilliantly writes about this, where he says like he says, but basically the lowest forms of being a human animal become sublime, become important, and the highest things become degraded. And what he means by that is, what's important is the toilet break. Going to the toilet is suddenly a wonderful thing because it gets you
Mm.
away from work. um, uh,
Yeah.
but whereas your creativity is, which is the part of you that's the most interesting, is that's kind of like given to being, making widgets that you make. Like, my friend of mine's thinking about selling kitchens. Now, nothing wrong selling kitchens. I think it's fascinating. But I was like, "Are you interested in kitchens?" He was like, "No, I'm not interested in kitchens, but I have to do something." And you go like,
Yeah.
and that's fair enough. He might get into it, but he's not passionate about kitchens. He just has to. So two is alienation, and three is lack of democracy. Someone like Richard Wolff says it's interesting, like somewhere like America that really values democracy, but there's no democracy in the workplace. You vote for all these other things outside of the workplace, but it's a monarchy within the workplaess.
Yeah. No
There's
freedom of speech.
yeah, there's no freedom. Yeah, and there's no freedom to vote for who the CEO is. There's no
Right.
ability to kind of like have a talk about how the money's used or anything like that. So we believe in democracy in terms of politically, but democracy has not entered into the workplace. And what would it look like to have a type of democracy, maybe where you're working for a company and you get a voice just a small voice, but a voice, and
Mhm.
how the profits are spent, who the CEO is, those kind of issues. So there's three, there's more, but those are three interesting things that, you could say are difficult within the current mode of production.
And the answer to how you would create that kind of work environment would be something like a union for what we currently have. Except my understanding, and I think what I hear a lot regarding unions is that they themselves are
Yeah.
often corrupt and not working on behalf of
Yeah.
the people they seem to represent too. Not to say that they all do that or that they don't also do good work, but that's just what I've heard.
Yeah. Yeah, no, totally. Like I'll be honest, and I hope I'm wrong about this, but it's similar to my, views on the Middle East. But I don't see the change happening anytime soon. And I don't see any alternative to capitalism at the moment, that's on the horizon. That's good. I see alternatives that are not good, but the idea of entering into a new mode of production, I theoretically have ideas of what that looks like, but I cannot. Terrifyingly, I can't see where that where that's going to come from and when
Yeah.
that's going to happen. Um,
This is,
so yeah,
I think, why I get so why I've gotten so into the idea of universal healthcare uh in America, not just because you're going, oh, other people have done it, or oh, we have 25, 27 million uninsured people. It's also the workplace thing. Like I have friends and that they have to stay at a particular job because of the health insurance. And so this idea then that when people say, well, we can't have universal health care because that's going to infringe upon, we're all going to have more taxes, it's going to reduce our freedom essentially. But then real freedom is the ability to go, I don't like working here, I'm going to go try something else. And I know I can do that because there's a social safety net that is going to
right.
keep me from squalor basically. But we don't give people that freedom. Instead, we're just like, no, here's your freedom is like this really amorphous kind of flat image of what freedom is.
The weirdest thing, see, when I first moved to America, I remember this really clearly, right? I used to speak live. I don't do any live speaking now at all, but used to go speak in places. And I remember people would sometimes ask me how I got how I trained to do what I did, which is writing, speaking, setting up these groups, stuff that I did. And I said to them, well, I went to university for a bit, then I took 8 years on unemployment benefit, 8 to 10 years, and I developed my craft. And I always got this really blank stare from the American students. And I didn't understand it. And then someone said to me, said, like, we can't do that.
Mm-mm.
I was like, oh, because now I lived in a squat for a while, but I was also given a house. I lived on unemployment benefit, had
Mm-hmm.
health insurance, I'd you live simply, but you live well. And I'm not saying anything good or bad about this, but I was like, oh, for me and a lot of my friends who were artists, I got a lot of friends who are artists, musicians, and a lot of the famous artists and musicians from Northern Ireland all had 8 or 10 years where they were just unemployed, just honing their craft. And someone said, no, like that's more difficult whenever you need healthcare, you need a job, you might not be able to get rent, you might not be able to be given a home, you might not, as I say, it was simple enough. But in Northern Ireland, especially then, like they would give you a house. If you had a bad kitchen, you would get your kitchen fixed. Now, there's all these problems with it. I'm honestly not saying this is a better system than America, but I just remember that thing where people were going, like the idea that I could take 8 years as a young person out, not work, and just,
It's foreign. It's very literally and figuratively foreign.
yeah, and that was amazing because back home, that wasn't just what it was possible. As I say, you had to live simply, but easy to do.
But we landed on the moon, and I haven't seen many Irish rocket ships going up. So
Yeah.
maybe.
Absolutely. And you know what? You know me in America. I love America.
Mhm.
So I am more pro America than many Americans. So,
I love America too, in all of its beautiful glory. Yeah, the something like the health insurance thing seems like a step toward giving people a little bit of a release valve from the pressures of the system that we're currently in. Now, my question to you, Peter Rollins, is when you were initially getting into Marx and learning about him, you're learning about him from this sounds like a really cool dude, and then you're diving into the material. What was your feeling when you were reading it? Were you like, oh my, like did it blow your mind? Were you like, oh, this guy gets it? This is and my understanding too, and how does this play? Where you go, okay, back to class consciousness. Was it like, okay, so thanks to my studying of Marx, I now understand that so many of the problems that we as a society face are ultimately rooted in like the material conditions of people's lives, like their ability to have, you know, food and health and all of that is kind of the driving force behind all of it. Did you have that kind of aha moment, or do you not even believe that? Is that also an oversimplification?
No, I did. I mean, this is the funny thing about not reading Marx, which again in America, because of the
Hmm.
Cold War and all of that, Marx is not really read. When you read him and you read him with somebody who's very good and an expert, whether you like him or not, you know that you're being confronted by a canonical mind, a great mind. So, and it's the same thing when you read, say, Freud, or you read
Hmm.
Nietzsche, or you read Heidegger, or you're just going like, whether you agree or disagree, you're like, whoa, whoa. And yeah, with Marx, um, another reason why I would say that I have a affinity with Marx is more because when I read his critique of capitalism, not anything else, just how he analyzed capitalism and how it works in its ideal form, uh, it was so brilliantly insightful.
Well,
And I don't think there's been a better critique. I like, yeah, I've read various. There's no better critique. I say you can disagree with it, and by the way, I have a complicated relationship with Marx, but you cannot deny when you read him that yes, it's almost like, oh my goodness, this is phenomenal, really, really
cool.
interesting. Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Oh,
so
we haven't even defined class consciousness. Maybe we should do that. Or I quite like the fact we've got this far
I
and
like talking
haven't
around it.
actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I like this. Yeah.
Yes. Hit me with it. How would you define class consciousness?
Yeah, like so I would say at its simplest, maybe it is when people within society start to become aware that um, that they that of the things that we talked about: alienation within the workplace, lack of democracy, lack of control within the workplace, creation of surplus value that is appropriated by other people, rather than, because there's an idea of surplus value being fed back in, which I actually really like. But when surplus value is appropriated by the
Hmm.
capitalist class or whatever, so class consciousness is when you start to become aware of that, become aware of your class condition. And this is why I see it as different from identity politics. Because in identity politics, what happens is, and as I said, like you look at Amazon, you look at Facebook, you look at all of these big corporations, they all can embrace it because it doesn't ask questions about alienation, democracy in the workplace, and the appropriation of surplus value. It's
Yeah.
it's not that at all. So it's very easy for them to also it separates us because we start to see ourselves as part of small communities that have intersections, but ultimately we are kind of separated. Whereas class consciousness, and the one quote that everybody knows of Marx is, workers of the world unite. It's a class consciousness is a unificatory thing because we realize that we're most of us uh, alienated from the means of production. We're alienated from our work. We spend the majority of our lives, even if we're making loads of money. That's the thing. Even if you're able to buy the Maserati, you've got a great, you're an accountant and you're doing that work. You're a hedge fund person. You kind of still go and like you could be putting in 80 hours, 100 hours a week. And yes, you have all of this money, but like you're kind of like still potentially spending the majority of your time doing something that you wouldn't really choose to do. But yeah,
Yeah. The that would be what makes it like structural, right? Like the antagonism or the contradiction within capitalism is structural in the sense that it echoes across every class, right? Like, I
Yes.
mean, so what do you say to people who are like, oh, you don't like that you're, because most people won't even think about it. They're going to work and they have their job, they're getting paid, and they're not conscious of that surplus value, especially not conscious of it being a bad thing or being something that is adding to their or reducing their quality of life. But what do you say to the people that are like, if you don't like it, go start your own business, get out, go do something else, ask
Yeah.
for more money, work harder, like these arguments that are like, if you don't like it, you're just not doing enough
Yeah.
kind of deal. Or start your own business if you don't want to work with people. But in my experience of having your own business, like you said, it's still, you're still going to oftentimes walk away feeling a little ripped off, or like you still spent your time toiling away. Uh, and you end up dying younger but richer with the Maserati, like that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, and this is where like I augment, well, this happened very famously within the Marxist tradition where psychoanalysis was brought into the theory with the Frankfurt School. But I think that Marxism and psychoanalysis work quite well together at times because what psychoanalysis brought to the table was two things. One is the idea that, one is the idea that the problem is partly libidinal. We seem to be, all of us, like you see this with dating apps, where people could start to get more addicted to the swiping than getting a partner, right? Or as I said, with Bitcoin, you get more obsessed with the abstract increase of capital outside of its value selfishly. So one of the arguments that Zizek makes, for example, which is brilliant, is like one of the arguments for capitalism, and Ayn Rand or whatever would say this, is that capitalism appeals to our selfishness, right? So, for
Yeah.
good or for bad, forget about whether it's good or for bad, capitalism appeals to our selfishness, and, that's why it kind of works.
The
But
baker selfishly wants to make the best loaf of bread. The butcher selfishly wants to make the best cut of meat. And then the consumer ends up with the best possible sandwich as a result of it.
yeah, and
But
like,
they're selfishly doing it. They want to make the best so that you buy
their product. Yeah.
yeah.
You want to create a widget that everybody wants. And so what Adam Smith talks about this is almost like a
And
person
yeah.
might selfishly want to make a widget just to make money, but it actually benefits society. You got an iPhone, and even if the iPhone was completely selfishly made, whoa, it benefits
Yeah.
whatever. But one of the counter arguments to that, which is a Freudian argument, is actually capitalism is very selfless. It's incredibly selfless in the same way that a zombie is selfless, or the alien in Aliens is. So a zombie will keep attacking you even if you're shooting it, right? It won't stop. And so there's an idea that whenever you get really into capitalism, really into the libidinal enjoyment of the increase of capital, what happens is you can't stop. Once you've made 5 million, you want
Yeah.
10, and 10, you want 20, and 20, you want 50. And then the doctor might say to you, you're going to give yourself a heart attack. You need to retire. You need to stop. But you can't. And you end up dying, and, your kids use all the money. And weirdly, or you step over your friends, or you break up with your partner because you're so obsessed with work. If you were selfish, you would stop at 5 million or 10 million, right?
Yeah.
Selfishness would be, hey, I can live the life I want. But somehow we get caught up, and this is the difference between most animals and humans, is an animal eats until they're full, or they get shelter, and once they've got shelter they stop. We will eat more than our fill, or we'll
Mhm.
want another house, a bigger house, an extension. There's something insatiable, again, drive, this an insatiable dimension to us, that is damaging, that actually damages us. So one thing I'm interested in is, well, it's fair enough to go off and do your own thing, but at a deeper level, is there a way that I can libidinally disinvest from this frenetic pursuit? So that's one question. Is it possible for us as a society to start to value a different way of life that would actually be, let's put it, selfish, right? And selfish in the sense of, like, we'd have loads of time for ourselves, and we wouldn't have a Maserati, but we'd have a nice car that got us around, and, we'd hang out with friends. So one is this libidinal investment. And then the second one, which is kind of strange, but I don't think it's strange at all, but is the idea that we can be alienated and not even know. We can, and this is the kind of people like Herbert Marcuse says, is that we are sitting watching TV at night, watching crap reality TV or whatever, and we think we're happy, right? And what Neil Postman calls it amusing ourselves to death, or Soren Kierkegaard would say that we're in despair, but we do not even know we're in despair.
Mhm.
So there's a certain sense in which, what if people don't feel this, and you go, it's not bad, and I'm just working away. But actually, the despair is not subjectively in their mind. This despair is in their heart disease. Their despair is in their argument with their partner. Their despair is with certain drug use, so their despair is objective. It's in the objective world, not in their subjectivity. And
Mhm.
and if that's the case, class consciousness is about, again, raising awareness of that, to kind of go, oh, I'm alienated, and I don't even know it. And I'm
Mhm.
invested libidinally in a system that is destroying me. And I don't even, in fact, not only do I not see it, I think the opposite. I think this system is benefiting me. I mean, that's
Mhm.
amazing. I think this is, I've made 30 million, 40 million, 50 million. Going like, yeah, but you've broken every relationship. You've destroyed friendships. Your doctor says you got high blood pressure. You can't stop. So yeah, so class consciousness for me is, again, starting to become just aware, not a, like, do your own thing, but just stopping and going, this might not be working for me.
Yeah, and it's not a because the reductive counter argument that I hear is this kind of haves and versus have-nots, and like it's kind of a funny critique because it still exists within the framework of capitalism because there's such an embedded assumption that your material possessions are like they give you some symbolic value of what you've accomplished in life. And look at all that I have, and look my kingdom that I've made. And so when those folks hear anything related to Marx or class consciousness, it's like, well, you're not going to take my stuff. Like, oh, you just want my stuff that I worked my butt off for. And it's like, oh no, that's like you're that person is still clinging to those things, whereas this sounds like a way of going toward a real type of freedom where people can quote unquote selfishly do their own thing and feel a sense of like being present in life and getting to explore their own
Yeah.
interests,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is arguably better than having a nice car.
100%. And like, I know, because when I first moved to America, it was because a dear friend of mine, who wasn't a dear friend at that time, but who wanted to support my work, lent me a house, and I lived for a while, just
Peter
living.
Thiel.
Peter Thiel, yes. But I lived in this area where the mega rich lived. And we're talking like, definitely, if you had less than 100 million, you weren't living in this area, right? You're talking from hundreds of millions to billionaires. And what's interesting, and it really, I mean, I always knew this theoretically, but I saw it firsthand, is we potentially live in a system where even the winners lose. The losers lose doubly, but even the winners lose. The amount of
Mm.
melancholy in those spaces, because if you think that sacrifice is actually really important, and this is one of the things about actually capitalism, is I think it has an ideal of the sacrifice of sacrifice. So one of the ideals is, I want to get to a point where I can sit by the beach, not have to worry about money, not have to worry about anything. But the problem is, if sacrifice is what brings meaning, then if you get to that point, you'll start getting really bored really quick. And then people often die in retirement very quickly,
Yeah.
because actually sacrifice is important. So very successful entrepreneurs who are brilliant, say a very talented entrepreneur, when they get their money, they will get more enjoyment talking about the struggle to get the money than having the money. So what you see is one of two things: is often you can only value what you've got. Sorry, that's my dishwasher. You can only
Oh, I can hear
value, oh good. You can only value what you've got if you either think it's under threat of being taken away, so you kind of introduce a little bit of conflict, or remember all of the struggles that got you there. But the actual, getting all the money in the world, if you don't have something that you believe in, some meaning in your life, something you want to give yourself to, yeah, your life is pointless and meaningless. So one of the
it.
problems I think in contemporary society is some people sacrifice too much, right? The worker sacrifices so much and doesn't get any of the value of that sacrifice, or very little of it. And then if you win, you don't sacrifice. And so
Hmm.
you don't sacrifice at all. So too much sacrifice here, not enough sacrifice here. Both of them are disastrous. Is it possible to think of a system in which we all sacrifice and we all share in the benefits of that sacrifice?
No.
No.
Pie in the sky. I can help you out there.
Yeah.
Easy question. Yeah, good stuff. And so going back to again class consciousness, uh, this, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but I'm also feeling like whenever these things happen, where you like you called the CEO thing an event
Mm.
at one point when we
Yeah,
were hanging out,
potentially. Yeah.
and you referenced that word, a potential event, and
Yeah.
you kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
you said it in a way I was like, oh, you mean something by that. But it's also kind of funny that these fires are referred to as incidents.
Oh yeah, that's funny.
Um,
Yeah, yeah, that's really
I,
takes the power out of them. Yeah.
yeah, the Eaton incident, the Palisades incident, uh, and this event. But yeah, these very generic words. But the it becomes a meme, like it becomes this sort of like oversimplified, highly like almost a trending topic. And I think that one thing I get pessimistic about is going like, okay, it is good for people to be thinking about this stuff and thinking about things within this context, but I just don't trust the internet enough that it's not going to eventually be misrepresented. And then any good that could come from that or any enlightenment that could come from it gets kind of squandered.
Yes. No, absolutely. And yeah, and I use that term event, as you said, because an event in philosophy kind of means a happening. So something that occurs in history. It can be like like it can be an assassination. It can be a new artist, a new type of art, a new type of literature, whatever it is.
Mm,
Something happens, and it's got no weird antecedents. It seems to come out of nowhere. It retroactively changes the past. So for example, before Kafka, Kafka was a whole new type of writing, and then later on, you start to look at, oh, there's Kafka-esque writings in the past, but that's only because Kafka exists. If Kafka never
yeah.
existed, you'd never find those. So it's an event. It happens in the present. It changes a conversation. It allows for a possibility of something radically new arising. Um, and so, yeah, they happen very rarely. And to be honest, yes, as you say, that in this age, a potential event can be flooded out by a million other news events and
Yeah.
everything else. So it's hard to know what an event will look like. Uh, when it'll happen. And by the way, that's the one hope I have is when I say I can't see how things are going to change necessarily. Events do happen, which change radically the discourse that raise class consciousness to bring it back to that. Whereas, as I said, I was in that coffee shop and this girl was talking about class consciousness, and I was like, oh. That can overnight happen. Like it doesn't look like it's going to happen, and then something occurs, and people say enough is enough.
Mm,
uh, Radical change, and I don't want to romanticize that. It can be horrific when modes of production change, when economic systems change. It can be messy. It doesn't have to be, but it's always a bit messy.
that's where my hypocrisy comes in. I'm like, look, we got to change it. This whole thing is broken. We got to change it from the ground up. And then I'm
Yeah.
like, but like, later,
Yeah.
like it's going to be exhausting. So,
Yes, I do. I know I'm in my 40s. Well, now I'm not. I'm in my 50s now. But like when I actually started to kind of be, I was able to afford to live in LA and do a lot. Yeah, then suddenly like it's like, oh yeah, this system is working for me.
yeah.
It doesn't work for I don't think many people, but then that makes it more difficult as the older you get sometimes.
Do you
But
think
at
you
the
could
end,
be,
okay,
could you be, could you be a billionaire and a Marxist? Do you think it's possible?
yeah, and
Or is
my
it hard? Is it harder for a rich man to come to Marx than it is for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle?
that's a great line, and it's a great question because a lot of people say no. A lot of people say it's harder if you're saying billionaire. I don't think it is because only in the sense of for me Marxism, right? For me, when I say I am influenced by Marx, what I mean is I agree with Marx's analysis of capitalism. I agree that it's not the end of history, i.e., another mode of production is possible, and I agree that basically the basic antagonisms that he identified seem to me to be correct. And so that
Fair enough.
doesn't, yeah, and but a lot of people would disagree and go no, no, no. But as a philosopher by training, um, I'm kind of go, well, it's just going like, do you think the argument is the
Yeah.
least bad argument we've got? But here,
Yeah.
what about you? And I like, because you've become more politically inclined in recent years. I don't know if you want to say too much about that, but you've become you
Hmm.
say politically awakened in some respects, or
I
politically
always,
interested.
yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like I'm very glad, I'm very fortunate that I've gotten into it, and I'm happy that I've gotten into it because it's definitely just like uh it's like crystallizing a little bit. Like stuff is coming into focus, to use a metaphor, a
Mm.
little bit more. But I still don't totally always understand it, and I can be a little ambivalent about it, especially when it comes to the relationship between more of the identity based stuff and the class based stuff. But I don't see those things as inherently
Yeah.
against each other.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's a lot of it is kind of. I mean, it's great that you know this stuff because I can actually ask about it because I'll read critiques and or the opposing side, and usually it's in the online space, and in a lot of them I've found
The
back
place
that
of quality, the place of academic quality.
yeah, and it kind of was like years ago I would read these things and be like, oh, it's so confusing, and now I'm reading them and going, oh, I have like I know that this critique is wrong, and it I know why it's wrong, and I can articulate why it's wrong. For example, one of them is like this well, if that's what you think, why don't you give all your money to poor people? And it's like that is not even remotely representative of the argument that it's trying to go against. Like
Yes.
it's not about taking one person's money or one individual not having more than another person.
Yeah.
It's just, it's a, what would you call, a negative critique, I guess, more
Yes.
so than a prescriptive.
And that's the thing, Marx. This is why Marx. And if you read, when you read Marx, there's no, it's not essentially an ethical argument. So you can have and I know very, very kind and generous capitalists, and you can have really, really awful, terrible socialists.
Yeah.
It's nothing. Yeah, as you say, exactly right. It's nothing to do with that. It's about analysis of, is this the end of history? Is this the last mode of production? Are there antagonisms that this system that we all participate in generate? And are those antagonisms going to cause economic catastrophe, climate catastrophe, wars, recessions, depressions?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Triple yes.
Mhm.
The for my part, I think most of it was my frustration with the Democratic Party here, and that coming to a head, and seeing it really, like having heard about it and then reading about it and then seeing it firsthand. I think that the past election, when I was in Vegas watching the Democratic National Convention, I was very frustrated because they dangled Tim Walz in front of us and then muzzled him and did this sort of really, I think, bad campaign that everyone can kind of do autopsies on afterward. But in that moment of the Democratic National Convention, I was like, this ain't it. And I was like, they're doing the same thing again. They're doing this really tone deaf, wishy-washy liberal crap, and that same sort of like, we're not Trump, so therefore you have to vote for us, and telling people like who are struggling that actually the economy is doing great, and like inflation is actually X, Y, and Z. And it's like all those things can be true, but they're not speaking to people where they're at. And then Trump comes along and speaks to exactly where people are at who are struggling, and gives them a very simple, palatable answer that is wrong and racist very often, uh, and ends up winning an election. But he's still speaking to what the to people's emotions in a way that I feel like the liberal left is just like, it's like they can't do it. They have no ability except for, and then the final thing again is Bernie Sanders. Over the years, Bernie Sanders has probably been my gateway into some
Yeah.
understanding of this stuff.
Yes, absolutely. And I was more a fan of Bernie Sanders maybe earlier on, but yes, Bernie Sanders definitely a very back in the day when he was the potential nominee or whatever, like that was interesting and exciting to me.
And
And yeah.
you've played a big role in it, to your credit or to your not
Yeah.
credit. But because I remember when I was first getting to know you, being like, I'm like in the liberal camp and I know that, and I'm not Republican, and it's like Democrat, yeah, and very just a Democrat, and no real political theory behind it or understanding behind it, just sort of like, I guess, reactionary. And I was like, why is these always talking crap about the Democratic Party? And now I'll be like at home and I'll be watching the news or something, and I'll hear myself and I'll be with my wife and I'll be like, I need to stop critiquing the Democratic Party for 2 seconds. But I also think that that's who you should critique. You should critique the party that you're in, not, get all hung up on the other one.
Yeah, that is a really good, I think, little tip in general in life is to try to critique whatever position you are. Like, so what who was it?
Yeah.
There was some really good quote, but a guy said, I find he says, I'm a man of the left until I hang out with leftists, and then I become very sympathetic to the right. And then when I hang out with people on the right, I become very sympathetic to people on the left.
Yep.
And there's a certain sense in which that's not a bad place to be, is to always try to critique whatever position and community you're part of.
Oh
And
yeah.
maybe that's how progress is made.
Yeah, that's I feel that all the time when I hang out with Democrats. I'm like, golly, y'all. And then I go hang out with my Republican family, and I'm like, oh, it's just, it's
And that's a
you
very
know, who,
existentialist position because, yeah, Albert Camus, the outsider, he ultimately says we're all outsiders. We try to avoid it. So we try to do groupthink. We try to think, Kierkegaard would say, with the crowd. But one, we're denying our freedom. And two, so in one sense, the existentialists are going, well, always try to think outside the crowd. So yeah, again, it's like a very existentialist position that I've always seen in you, because I like see that there's a very natural tendency for you to, when you're in some political or philosophical community, to start going, hold on a second, rather than I'm bought in, give me the membership card.
yeah, that's got to be probably the upbringing, right? That's got to
Yeah.
be my um
And a good bit of the that's probably a good bit of the Republican upbringing. Like that's the thing. Every party and every group has something really good to give, and maybe you had a bit of a bit of a skepticism about big government or big powers, or kind of I don't know whether that was part of your childhood or not, but
a lot of it was as a child in high school and middle school being like, why is it that the country is 50-50 divided? That didn't make sense to me on a mathematical level. Like
uh,
there's this line in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, where George Clooney's character is trying to get some hair pomade and it has to be shipped to the store. And the store clerk is like, oh, we can get it. It's going to be 2 weeks. And then it's another product. It's like, oh, it's going to be another 2 weeks. And George Clooney's character is like, wow, this place is 2 weeks from everywhere. It's a geographical anomaly. And I remember, like, as a kid, just being like, what are the odds that every single issue
yeah.
is split down the middle 50-50, and why is it that half of the country and the other half, like, it's so perfectly divided, and then why is it that all of these people believe something so opposite, and then you
Mhm.
start reading why they think that differently, and you're like, oh, that's actually, some of that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, totally. Like my ideal for argument is, I probably said this before, but in the traditional argument is, you're a Republican, I'm a Democrat or whatever. And I'm trying to convince you, you're trying to convince me. And even if we know that that won't happen, we're trying to convince the audience who are listening. But in this other approach, I come to you and I say, you'll never make me a Republican. I'll never make you a Democrat, but you might make me a better Democrat and I might make you a better Republican. So maybe I can see myself through your eyes, see what I'm missing. Like, let me really listen to what you're saying, because I don't
Mhm.
think I'm missing anything. I think I'm completely right and you're completely batshit. But then you use the other person's eyes in order to see yourself, and you go, oh,
Yes.
yeah, I see there's a few problems here. And then weirdly, we both become better Republicans and Democrats within our own systems. So, a very different way of engaging with the other.
And then you shake hands and you go, but screw the Clintons, right? And then you
Yeah.
go, yeah, screw the Clintons, and then you
Amen.
do yeah, and reading history is also a big part of it. Okay,
Yeah.
so class consciousness is exactly what it sounds like, basically.
Yes, yeah, that's it. Become conscious of the class conditions that it actually affects everybody. In fact, including the rich who win in many ways, but even weirdly lose. Even the winners lose, and it joins us all together. We start to see that maybe this system is alienating to us. We're being undervalued. There's a lack of power and democracy within our workplace. Yeah.
One more question, potentially too. When we are talking about class consciousness, so the way that you'll hear about it here is lower, middle, upper, right?
Oh yeah.
And there's this kind of idea that it's like segmented in thirds because you hear three and you're like, oh, okay, so there's like the bottom, and then there's this big middle, and then there's this top. But like, would you consider how big is the working class when the billionaires are become and the corporations are so powerful? Wouldn't the working class still include like a lot more people than would traditionally be thought? Like
Yeah.
because the disparity is so much greater. So like even someone like would you consider someone who maybe is even a millionaire or multimillionaire to still be part of a working class of the working class?
That's a great, like, yeah, potentially you can be very wealthy and still be alienated, still be undervalued in terms of just you're producing more value than you're getting, and you have lack of democracy, lack of power within the workplace. So yeah, technically, the middle classes, for example, are doing, the whole development of the middle class. Some people think that was what really stopped. That's what prolonged capitalism, because you could be alienated, you could have lack of power, and you could still be undervalued. But you get enough that life can be quite nice. I mean, the issue within Marxism is that the middle class will always be eroded. Eventually things tend towards um, really poor and a small number of
Yeah.
the really wealthy.
Entropy.
There's arguments against that, but
I'm reading this book on the psych. It's making the constructing the self constructing America, a cultural history of psychotherapy, and it
oh,
talks about how in the 20th century, every civilization will have an illness, a practitioner, and a technology for the illness, or soul illness of some kind, or psychological illness. And in the 20th century in America, there were two technologies that were used to address the sickness of the individual. And one was psychotherapy, especially psychoanalysis when Freud brought it over, and which then, didn't remain entirely separate from the more capitalist system. But then advertising and consumption were like the other technology used to treat the ailments of the person. And so you would either go talk to a therapist about what was going on in here, or you would see a sign that, this new soap is going to make you more attractive. This new cigarette's going to make you look cooler. And that's going to be the thing that makes you whole.
that's very good. I think that's a brilliant
That's
analysis,
fun.
and it's very similar to, like, basically with this frenetic desire that we feel, to, as I say, it comes out in lots of ways, like in dating apps, swiping rather than the date, or kind of money, abstract increase of capital beyond what it can buy. All of these things, it's either there's a promise that you can fulfill that drive, or there's a way to rob it of its sting. And
Yeah.
psychoanalysis is designed to rob it of its sting, and advertising gives you a product that supposedly sates it.
Yep.
And ultimately, I think that's a technology that doesn't work.
Yep.
Very
You could
good.
say.
You could say whether or not analysis works. That's a question for another time. But that's a reasonable question as well. Yeah.
We just won't talk about that one.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Any takeaways, Pete? I mean, any final?
Yeah, I think I gave a takeaway at one stage. I
You
can't
did.
remember
It
what it
was
was. It
good
felt
about
that.
the arguing, the
Oh yeah, there's my takeaway. What about you? Have you got a good one?
Citizens United, I guess we should get rid of.
What's that?
I think that's what allows corporations to act as people and to influence elections
Ah,
via super PACs, so they can fund politicians that act in their interests.
oh yeah, yeah. That's an area I know very little about. I know you know a lot more about that than me, but I'll join you in.
I'm talking out of my butt again. Um, yeah, remember to hug a millionaire.
Yes,
No.
Brush your teeth twice a day. There you go.
Yeah.
All right.
Excellent. All right.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Bye bye.